Aloha and welcome to Reflections on Interpretation, talking story with guides and interpreters. I am Tim Merriman, your host, coming to you from the Big Island of Hawaii. And my co-host from Denver, Colorado area is Bill Gwaltney. He's here today. He's going to introduce two very special guests.
Well, Tim, thanks very much. We do have two very special guests, and I've been really anxious for this opportunity simply because we often talk about interpretation, of course, but we often don't think about the research and the social science that supports what we think we know. Today, we have two real experts who are both in academia, but they both have a very long and deep interpretive background as well. And we're going to ask them to tell us a little bit about themselves and about their work. So first, I'm going to start with Bob Powell. Tell us and the audience a little bit about yourself, your personal and professional connections to the business of interpretation.
Okay. Thank you first for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and talking with the Interp Nation, so to speak. But I am currently a professor at Clemson University. I also direct an institute there called the Institute for Parks, which is focused on providing research and training to support park management worldwide. And my background prior to going into academics was as an adventure guide. I started as a raft guide and as an adventure leader. I worked in over 40 different countries around the world for about 20 years. And so it was my profession. And while I was in the Grand Canyon working there, I was introduced to the whole notion of interpretation. We were providing interpretation without knowing what it was called for many years in the early 80s when I was guiding in a lot of places. But there in the Grand Canyon, we actually had a training on how to do it better, how to do visitor engagement, how to do better interpretation. And so that was my introduction to it. And over the next about 10 years after that, I became more of a student of it and learned a lot more about it, picked up Sam Hamm's book and a few other folks before I went back to grad school.
Marc, could you tell us similarly about yourself and kind of what got you into this professional area?
Yeah, sure. And yes, thanks for having us. It's really fun to be able to talk with you. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. I'm in a department of forest resources and environmental conservation. So we come at pretty much everything from that environmental side of things. Prior to going back to grad school, I was a wilderness skills instructor. So I was also doing interpretation and didn't know what it was called back then. Now, when I went to grad school, my doctoral research was on relationships between national parks and the people that live around them. So something like park-people relationships, local communities and such. And my work was in the U.S. in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, also in the Caribbean and in a park in southern Ecuador. And one of the themes that emerged from that research was how the quality and subject matter of interpretation really has a powerful influence on local communities, right? Like we make choices about the histories that we share in these stories, and that mattered to local people. So that really set me off on a path to want to learn a whole lot more about it. It became part of my doctoral research to understand that a whole lot more. And then when I got hired at Virginia Tech, I had to teach a class right off the bat in interpretations. I learned a heck of a lot more right then and there. I remember I took the office of Joe Rogenbuck, who's a name known in interpretation as well. Got in a lot of opportunities to work with the National Park Service, and it just became core to both Bob and myself and the work that we do.
I have taught for a long, long time that interpretation is management. It is a part of the management tool set. And yet I see organizations or systems that just don't use it that way. It's kind of icing on the cake, and it gets scraped off when budgets get tough.
Boy, that's so true. I mean, the first thing to get dropped and the last thing to get added is often interpretation. Well, Bob, my next question for you, and I really am anxious to get, of course, to the science bit, but we're going to ask both of you gentlemen, where did you grow up and how did you go to school and what sort of begun to drag you in this direction, although we heard some very specific information just then?
Yeah. So I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Went to undergraduate school at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Received interdisciplinary major. They didn't have parks and recreation. They didn't have an environmental studies kind of degree back then. And so I sort of made my own major up and then worked for the Park Service and Forest Service before rolling into that adventure travel career. After the adventure travel career, I went back to graduate school at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, got my master's and then my PhD there. And my work was focused on the interpretive experiences as part of multi-day adventure travel programs. So I did research in the Galapagos Islands, Antarctica, and the Grand Canyon. And if you think of those sort of ecotourism experiences in those locations, interpretation's a key part of those experiences. And so I was really interested in doing a deep dive into how interpretation is used in these experiences to support sustainable tourism practices as well as enhance the visitor experience. And Sam Ham was on my committee along with Steve Kellert. And so it was a natural progression from my kind of before academic days. These were some questions that I really had about what practices lead to better outcomes, basically, in these ecotourism environments.
That's great. Marc, if we could get a similar explanation of your hometown and what led you into this.
Sure. I grew up in New Jersey.
Oh,
You meet a lot of us from New Jersey who now live somewhere else. Um, I went to undergraduate at Cornell, and I guess it's part of the story. Yeah, while I was there, I majored in natural resources, so I got a BS in natural resources, and I was already sort of trending toward an interest in like the human dynamics of nature protection, things like that. But I did a study abroad in Nepal. And while I was there, I was living like in the Kathmandu Valley, taking some courses at this university. And it was really cool to live in Nepal, don't get me wrong, but like the courses left a lot to desire. They're not that interesting. So somehow I'm still amazed. I look back and I don't know how I pulled this off, but I convinced the World Wildlife Fund Nepal that they should pay for me to get on a helicopter and go up to the Everest region to study Sherpa myths of nature. I got my university to agree that, oh yeah, that'd make a good honors thesis. Go ahead and do it. So I got to spend over a month up in the Everest region. And when I got up there, I set off to interview the Amches, which are like the spiritual, like medicinal healers first. And but as soon as I got there, I realized like that was kind of interesting. But the real interesting story was this national park, which is the second national park ever created in Nepal. And it was only created about 5 years after the first one. The first one, they kicked all local people out. It was Royal Chitwan National Park. So when folks up in the Everest region found out that they were going to be a national park, the first thing they did is they deforested the whole thing because they thought they'd get kicked out too. Eventually, it was determined that they'd be allowed to stay, but they would only have a few choices for livelihood, right? Their resources were going to be cut off. Their access to resources would be cut off. They'd have limited access, let's say. So they could either stay and join the tourism trekking industry, they could leave and go to Kathmandu and do something else, or they can stay and suffer. So I was really exposed to this dark side of conservation at, I think I was 20, yeah, I think I was 20. It really pushed me all the way into the human dimensions of this world. And that's why I eventually went back to grad school, because I really wanted to study how can you have national parks in a way that doesn't inflict all this harm on the people that live in these places. So that led me to studying park people conflicts, which eventually led me to studying interpretation as a major component of that. And I did my master's and PhD also at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and that's how Bob and I met. We met there while we were both master's students.
I'm fascinated that you had so much international background, both of you. Lisa and I, my wife, Lisa Brochu, had the pleasure of literally working and training more than 20 countries around the world. And as recently as March, we were in Rwanda training again with African Parks Foundation with Rwandan National Park guides. And it changes your perspective when you have a global perspective and you
Yes.
understand that while we've got over 400 national parks in the United States or monuments and historic sites, that some of these countries have two or three or four, and sometimes they have a staff of two or three or four with a park of 100,000 acres or 100,000 hectares. And so uh, it's really important that they understand all the different tools. But you've transitioned all of this into academics. How does that work? What got you into thinking, how do I make interpretation better from an academic standpoint?
Also guiding and alongside many of them in observing these programs. And I sort of realized that sometimes interpreters or guides don't always know what they're doing and or don't report it the same way that maybe we would in an academic sense. So Marc and I started collaborating. We did an evaluation in the Smokies together while we were in grad school. And that led us to some other opportunities to work in the Smokies on their, I guess, junior ranger programs, which is kind of interpretive and environmental education both, and comparing those programs across multiple sites and districts and providers. And we tried another comparative study to sort of ask that question, what leads to better outcomes? Can we tease apart that? And we had this big checklist of all these different techniques that the interpreters and educators were supposed to keep track of what they were doing. And then we went to watch them and realized that they don't always exactly report what they report what they thought they should be doing versus what they actually did. So, long-winded way of saying we were just really interested in that big question of what leads to better outcomes, what evidence is there to support the practices that are promoted widely, whether it be Tilden or Sam Hamm's work. There's theory behind it, but are there a lot of studies that support those, and can we sort of build out the profession?
I really like what you're doing. In fact, I quote it I've developed a new training program based on a HEART acronym for holistic, engaging, appropriate, rewarding, and thematic. And I quote your study in it because I've suggested many times that tourism uses interpretation routinely as an approach to communication, sometimes without even knowing the field exists. Sadly, too much tourism internationally has become lecturing on the move, not a conversation, which I think of interpretation as always being a conversation. Is that how you see it? Did you see it as a conversation?
I'd say yes, but a conversation can look really different in different settings, right? So it should always feel like a conversation, maybe. In the large scale studies we've done, where our question is, all right, of all the things, all the different approaches you can use for interpretation, which ones tend to lead to better outcomes? An example of one of these elements we might measure would be the degree of responsiveness of the interpreter to the audience. And this is something we grapple with because it's a hard thing to measure, first off. And we always come to this debate about this one variable. It's like, well, how do you be responsive if literally it's like a program in an auditorium with 300 people? But I think this speaks to what you're saying is like, in a small group conversation, yes, absolutely. It should be two-way. It should feel like there's a relationship between the interpreter and the audience. Where we land on this is it should feel that way too in a 300-person audience. It should still feel that way. You should build a connection to the speaker. And sometimes when I talk to students about interpretation, or when I'm trying to talk to interpreters about interpretation, about like raising the bar, I think a lot of interpreters undersell what we do. And they just feel like, well, if I tell them some facts, they're happy. I mean, that may be pretty true in a lot of cases. But I often think about interpretation like a really amazing movie or like an incredible book that changed your life, right? Like a really good interpretive experience could be that.
Yes.
Like, yeah, it was great. It was fun. I enjoyed it. And like months or years later, it's just coming up for you in the back of your mind and it's replaying here and there and it's touched you in some way like that. And I think without that conversational element, without that relational element, where it feels like I had some sort of connection to the speaker. Yeah, you just don't get there. And our research shows that. I mean, with p-values and statistics and everything. So,
And I love that because part of what I train around is I love the term you've been using. I train around the idea that interpreters don't give talks, they create experiences.
mm,
And that experiences, even if I have 500 in an audience, it doesn't stop me from saying, how many of you have been here before, and getting a show of hands? And how many of you have been on the waterfall trail? And starting to build that conversation. And like you say, with a small group, it should be even better. It should be a relationship. But even with a big group, well, Sam Ham points out so often, one of the biggest challenges is getting everybody to pay attention.
yeah.
And if you don't have some techniques that get them to think, well, what do I think about that? Then very often I'm thinking about the thing I should have done at home before I left rather than what the person's talking about.
Kim Sikoriak and Richard Cohen were big fans. They shared with me a PowerPoint, which I have shared like cold water on a hot day. So, Bob, let me ask you two questions, and then, Marc, I've got two for you. How did it get started, and who paid for the study?
Okay. So great question. And we alluded to this, that we were working in the Smokies with a person named Kathy Cook, who was on the National Education Council for the National Park Service. She really liked our work, our comparative work that we did on both interpretation as well as on their education programs in the Smokies. And we were presenting up there to the NEC in DC, and they were interested in developing for the 200th. They wanted to, or the 100th, I mean, the kind of good
Centennial.
guidelines, updating their guidelines for promising practices for interpretation. And they wanted it based in evidence. And so we pitched this big idea. Then Marc took it to John Jarvis and the Leadership Council and pitched it. And then the Center for Park Management, which is part of NPCA, funded it and funded this big study in 2012 that allowed us to do that big comparative study.
Thanks for that. So, Marc, I'm going to ask you who else was on the team, you two gentlemen, and what was the intended outcome of the study as the people who funded it might have suggested?
Right. So Bob and I were the principal investigators, and then the rest of the team was our grad students. So there were two grad students at Virginia Tech, Kevin McLean and Beth Muchler, and two graduate students at Clemson, Emily Martin and Jen Thompson. So it wasn't a huge team, but it was a pretty mighty one. And just to go a little further on Bob's story about how we came into this. So, all right, well, first you asked what were the outcomes, the intended outcomes. The intended outcomes were, could we identify, we don't love the term best practices, but basically, yeah, best practices, like empirically speaking, what approaches have evidence for creating the outcomes that the National Park Service is trying to achieve in their audiences. So the outcomes were pretty simple that we were looking at. One was satisfaction, like the audiences like it. What makes an audience like it more or less? We had another variable we were looking at that was made up of a number of survey items called visitor experience. And that's basically, how meaningful was the experience? Did it enhance their appreciation for the park and park resources? And the last was behavioral change. And it wasn't necessarily a specific set of behavioral change. It was just like, hey, as a result of this program, are you inspired to do anything, whatever it might be? So those were the outcomes we were looking at, and that was based on some participatory work with the Park Service. The way we actually started was with a big literature review. We did a systematic literature review of every study we could find in the decade prior that measured an outcome of an interpretation program. And we were hoping like, gosh, if we find a whole lot of these, maybe hundreds of programs have been evaluated, and if the program descriptions are really good, the answer might already be there, right? Like, yeah, look at this. And that was working with, we had another colleague, Jeff Skibbins, right, who was at Clemson at the time, who helped us with the literature review. So another member of the team. And what that literature review showed was like pretty much every study was a one-off evaluation of a singular program. And it was sort of like a thumbs up, thumbs down, how'd the program do? And it was 99% thumbs up because nobody publishes null results, right? So it's sort of circumstantial evidence that like everything we assume works is what we found in the literature review. So it was another sort of argument we were making for like, we absolutely must go into the field. The literature doesn't answer this question. We have great theory. We have good minds, right? Like we've got Tilden, we've got Tim, we've got Sam Ham, we've got all these great people who've been writing about this forever, but let's go find the evidence.
Everything Lisa and I have taught in our training around the world, and I'm teaching in this heart program that I teach through right now, train through, is look back at the research and see what it tells you. And I keep bringing up the specific research studies that I think have impact on interpretation. If I watched in my early years in the 70s, I call what the training was all built around what I call gimmicks, gadgets, and goodies. I I like the term interpretainment, not because I want us to do that, but because I think a lot of what has been done is that. It's an interpreter or a guy doing something that was entertaining, didn't necessarily advance the cause of the organization very much or make a deep impression, that memory we hope the guest has that changes their life a little bit, that they look at the world differently from then on because of that experience. It's not just a photograph they show somebody. It's, wow, that touched me. I have to think about this. So are there real things that you felt the study revealed that stands out, something we just all need to think about?
Sure. I'll kick us off with a few, and then Marc can jump in with a few because there's actually quite a few takeaways. The first thing I think we could say is that it largely supported Tilden's and Sam Ham's work around thematic interpretation and that it's organized, that there's some provocation or way of connecting to the resources through different techniques like linking intangibles and universal concepts, links to those, cognitive engagement techniques, being relevant to the audience, affective messaging, all of those kind of roll up. So it was largely supporting what those folks were writing about and what, Tim, you were teaching. In addition, there was this idea that, and largely been overlooked. I mean, there's hints of it everywhere, right? Of that the interpreter characteristics and what they actually do, their attributes matter, and that you can actually train around being responsive, their comfort, apparent knowledge, their sincerity, and kind of setting a positive sort of climate, right? To have that conversation that y'all were talking about at the start. So those actually were pretty telling and actually very, when we kind of looked across all of them, they were pretty influential in driving better outcomes, those interpreter characteristics also. But I'll hand it off to Marc to talk about a few other things.
Yes, absolutely. We had this one question that was almost an afterthought that we put into the study. And it was after pilot testing a little bit, and we were, I don't know, we had this guess, this inclination that, like the mood of the interpreter probably matters. We think it matters a lot, right? And as Bob was saying, we did find that sincerity, passion, those things totally mattered. They were statistically linked to outcomes. So we asked this question on a scale of 1 to 10, I think it was like, all right, interpreter, like right now you're about to give this program on a scale of 1 to 10. We know that this probably varies. how excited are you right now to give the program you're about to give? And we had no idea what people would tell us. We assumed everyone was just going to lie and be like, oh, it's a 10, here I go. It ranged from 2 to 10 on the scale. I think the average was something like a 6 something like that. I mean, we got good variability. And it turned out that was highly predictive, not just to how they performed, but of visitor outcomes. So, I mean, it's going along with what you said earlier, Tim, about this being a conversation, about this relationship between the interpreter and the audience. And the way I talk to my students about this, and the way we talk to interpreters about this, is like, you're not going to feel that way every day, right? But it's kind of like a great actor going on stage. You've got to be the version of yourself that's going to be the best version for your program. So you can't pretend you're somebody else, right? You only stretch from here to here, right? So you still got to be yourself, but like you've got to somehow psych yourself up, like a warrior going into the battle or the quarterback before the Super Bowl, right?
And people intuit that if someone's not into it, right? Like an audience picks that up right away if someone doesn't want to be there. So you can only fake it till you make it so far, and then folks sniff that out.
I always train around the idea that there's nothing worse than a memorized spiel. And
Sure.
I do it from the point of view of saying, if I'm having a conversation with my audience, I start firing myself up based on what I'm hearing them say back. And
Sure.
and that conversation gets more and more exciting. And if I don't do that, I just kind of do it the way I've done it 150 times before, then it falls flat. And I always remember Dan Murphy, who was a very special interpretive supervisor in Park Service, and he was at St. Louis at the Jefferson Expansion Memorial. And he said, when I put a young seasonal worker in front of a replica teepee and they have to give the same talk 150 times in one day, how do I keep that interesting? He said, I've got to train them around. He said, first of all, I have to rotate them to different roles so they don't get too terribly bored. But secondly, I got to figure out how do you inspire them to keep finding the joy in that. So I love that outcome.
Well, I think it bleeds into exactly where it kind of led us in our thinking. And I teach this in class too. Like I teach eye contact as a thing. Like a lot of students, like undergrads, are afraid of that, right? It's very intimidating. But really flipping it, like if you make eye contact and you find a friendly face, my God, does that make a difference as the interpreter? Like, and most people in your audience are rooting for you, right? They don't want to see a crappy program. They want you to do well. So like making that eye contact, having a little conversation, it can really reduce nerves a lot.
Sure.
Well, what I was going to say, and thank you guys for those answers, I am personally very excited about the study because it actually sort of points out personal and professional traits and qualities that have been proven now to be successful. And as you say, people like Freeman Tilden and Sam Hamm and Tim Merriman, had those too, but you've been able to bring social science into the question, which is a really powerful thing. So my set of questions now, and anybody can answer, both of you can answer, what implications do those traits and qualities bring for first interpreters and for interpretive supervisors?
One of the things we wrote about at the end of the study was a little bit of a reinterpretation of the famous interpretive equation. Right? So the interpretive equation being knowledge of the resource, knowledge of the audience, plus appropriate techniques equals interpretive outcomes, right? Which is very helpful for just knowing, like, you got to know your audience, you got to know your resources, and you got to know some techniques, right? That knowledge of the resource one, we feel like often trips people up. We've observed a lot of trainings. And as part of our study, we went and observed trainings in the Park Service. And oftentimes we'd find them entirely focused on that one, knowledge of the resource. You got to have your timeline right. You got to have your facts right. And there's nothing wrong. You got to know the resource, right? But I think there's often an implicit assumption on people getting trained that way, that the reason you got to know it so well is because you better make sure you share every fact you know with your audience, right? And just keep shoveling the facts on no matter what, like get it right. And we found our students were tracking the archetypal identities of interpreters, and we found the walking encyclopedia was negatively statistically correlated with outcomes. The person who's just shoveling the facts on, that's not good, right? But if we come back to the interpretive equation, that knowledge of the resource does something different. The better I know the resource, the less nervous I feel, right? Like, so if I really know my stuff, I can stop thinking about the stuff and I can finally focus on all this other stuff we've just been talking about. I can focus on the relationship I'm going to have with the audience. I could focus on like letting them help me tell the story a little bit. I can focus on all this other beautiful stuff if I know the resource well enough. And if I don't know it quite well enough, I can still be humble about it. You know, if you ask me a question, I don't know the answer, be like, hey, you know what? When we get back to the visitor center, why don't we look it up together? I don't know. Like, that's the right answer. It's totally okay. So anyway, I think it's a slight shift, right? But it's a really important one. Like, where does that knowledge come in? Well, it comes in to make you comfortable so that you can do a really great job on the communication part of all this.
So, Bob, I'd like to ask you the same question as it might relate to interpretive supervisors.
Mhm.
Great question. Okay. Well, just following on Marc's thought is this idea that piling facts on while again you have new volunteers, new interpreters, you've got seasonals that are new to a park, and it's understandable to focus on making sure that that they build their knowledge so that they're comfortable and can build a thematic and provocative program. And that's the idea, right? Is we're not going to say what technique is whether it be a walk or a talk or a conversation or a facilitated dialogue kind of style, dialogic technique. Generally, if you have these components, though, that it's more of a story, thematic, that it is provocative, any one of those will work, right? And an array, probably, if you're a supervisor, might be a good thing to provide audiences with choices. We're currently redoing this study right now. And one of the things that as part of it, we investigated what do audiences desire and what types of programs do they want. And really what folks want is to learn more about the place that they're visiting. And they're not necessarily interested in having a conversation and hearing from other visitors about what they think. They want to understand more deeply about the stories of the place. They don't want to kind of have a debate with the visitor next door to them that they don't know. And so I think one of the implications of our first study is I think that folks, when they think about fact-based programs, they assume stage on the stage. And as opposed to, it's okay to have in your array of different interpretive programs that you're offering, have one that's largely a talk with some cognitive engagement and audience engagement techniques worked in, but you might have 300 people in the audience. That's okay, right? You're just not piling facts on. You're telling some nice stories that are organized, thematic, all those kind of using those broader principles. And so I guess from a supervisor standpoint, I'd say hire well, focus on those soft skills. Don't assume that folks get it, that they know to put their phones down, that they know to be responsive. Sort of set the tone for that. Also demonstrate well what you mean by providing more of in their trainings the actual interpretive techniques, and as well as having time to build their knowledge base.
Feel as a supervisor, if I'm like first thing about hiring,
Yeah.
right? There's lots of people who could be interpreters. I think what we saw in this study was a lot of the field is just setting a really low bar. And when we think about audience motivations to come to a program, like we did a study on this in the Smokies, and it was basically like, yeah, they want to be entertained. They think they might get a chance to see something they might not otherwise see. Maybe it's good for other people in their group, and they want to learn something. Those are pretty like simple to satisfy, right? So even mediocre interpretations satisfying most audiences. And we found that our data play that out. Like most people, we used to joke, like, unless the ranger threw up on them, it was probably okay, you know? But what we're talking about, and the words that we use to get all academic, was like there's hedonic satisfaction, right? Which is just satisfying your expectations. Oh, it was good. It's fun. Great. Loved it. And then there's eudaimonic satisfaction, which is this other level, which is like bringing people to the idea we've been talking about, like an epiphany, like some provocation, some deeper meaning that sticks with them. They're a little bit different after the program than they were before. And we saw programs that did that. So as a supervisor, what I'm concerned about is, what do my interpreters think the goal is supposed to be? If it's just satisfying the audience, man, anyone can do that. And it's no wonder I'm the first like function in the parks to get cut and the last one to get added back if that's all I'm doing. If I am changing people's lives, we'll be realistic, but really touching people in a way that inspires them and has them walking away feeling something meaningful, I'm a whole lot more valuable, right? So I think in hiring, we can do that. We can ask people like, hey, what is interpretation supposed to do? What do you aspire to? And I'm just like, I don't know. I'm just going to tell some facts and get the dates right. Like, that's not where we want interpreters to be, right? That attitude doesn't lead to the outcomes we want to have. And we can train this way too, right? We can set the bar higher. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to do this. We're not just playing the role of rattling off the dates. You might as well just have a sign, or like they can go online and find that stuff out. It's more now than ever, right? So it really is that connection, that relationship that folks are looking for, and moving them to somewhere deeper. Audiences don't know they're looking for that, because until you've seen it, you don't even know it's possible, right? So like for most people, yeah, you tell me the story, what happened here, I'm happy. Oh, I met a ranger. Hey, that was cool. We met a ranger, right? But once you've seen an amazing program, it all changes for you.
Right.
Right? Like, wow, the types of experiences I can have are amazing.
And you gentlemen know that I live in Hawaii, and one of the problems we have in Hawaii is most organizations don't invest in training. And one of the reasons they don't is the resource works so well for most people that even a bad guide can't beat it, can't can't ruin it. And that's too bad. I will say Hawaii State Parks is heavily invested in training and cares very much about getting it right. But I used to say, when I interviewed somebody, I'm looking for enthusiasm, that they care about what they're doing, that there's a fire inside them that they can't put out. And I can teach them more information. I can put them in contact with better content. I can't light a fire in somebody that really doesn't care.
Right. Well, that's Tilden's priceless ingredient, right? Passion.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Love.
Have to have.
Yeah.
Love, passion. Yep.
Yep.
Well, gentlemen, based on, and I know we can't go on all afternoon as much as I'd like to, but based on your study, your experience, and the updating of this study, what do you think it's important for our listeners, interpreters all, to know about interpretation and its future as a profession?
Well, I was just thinking about Dylan Schneider is this group that does market analysis. And I sat through one of their presentations of their national data that they do on organizations like the National Park Service, but also other cultural centers and zoos and aquaria and things like that. All these folks that provide interpretive services. And one of the things that was most predictive of a positive experience was a positive experience with a staff member, and to have sort of a behind the ropes experience, a unique experience with that staff, a meaningful interaction with them. And I just think interpretation, if we're doing it well, and as Marc alluded to, providing those amazing experiences through our interpretive efforts and enhancing that sort of interaction, whether you're in Hawaii and that resource is already a 10, you can make it an 11, right? and really drive home the cultural meaning of that place as well as the stories behind it and its beauty. Turn it into an awe experience. So I think interpretation, if done well and marketed, and we take care of ourselves and position ourselves and use our interpretive skills to talk about what we do, then hopefully the profession will continue. I know it'll be an important part of tourism. It'll be an important part of most park experiences. And just hope the funding continues.
Well, I'd like to ask Marc to answer the same question in terms of, what you've learned about interpretation from this study and other work that you've done. What should our listeners know about the future of interpretation?
I think I probably have two things I'd like to highlight. So one follows right off on what Bob said. So in another hat that I wear, I do research on natural resource and environmental conflict. And even in the study that I did that I mentioned earlier, my doctoral research, I found that the most predictive variable in those situations, it's not economics, it's not environmental attitudes, it's not values. It comes down to trust. Whether people trust the managers of these places to be fair and honest with them, to be good people, basically. Interpreters play a huge, huge role in that. So all of these practices we're talking about lend a hand into that, and it can enhance management, which brings me to my second point. And I think Tim brought this up earlier, that interpreters need to be at the table in management decisions. And we need to move the division of interpretation in places like the National Park Service to demonstrate how interpretive practices can help with management, because they absolutely can.
Right.
But oftentimes what we see is an interpretive division kind of off doing its own thing, telling the stories that are very nice. But superintendents and resource managers just don't see the link. The link's very easy to make. And it's very easy for me as a supervisor to help my staff just kind of move what they're doing a little bit into that realm. Still do all the things they love to do, but make those connections to actual issues that managers are dealing with.
I am just astonished by your own passion for what you've delivered today, because I enjoyed your study. I felt there were some great take-home messages I could use in training, but you've really illuminated kind of why this whole thing matters. We keep teaching about the research and hoping it lands for people. I mean, I have to tell you, if I share the elaboration likelihood model or Fishbein's theory of reasoned action or something with basic folks, it's a little too complex and out there, but they need these kind of research studies and background, and they need to know what the take-home message is for them. What do I do differently as that person? We were training in Rwanda, and one of the things that was heartening about that is we would have administrators, cafe workers, gift shop workers, and guides all in the same room going through interpretive training. And it was really good because you would get that sense that the administrator was seeing how their own staff reacts to these kinds of background information on why they should do what they do. And we were emphasizing to a cafe worker or a bookstore that every conversation is a chance to create an interpretive opportunity for a guest.
Mm-hmm.
You may suggest the book they could read, the video they could watch, the trail they could take, the experience they could have on with a guide that makes a real difference in their lives and a real difference in their experience on this very expensive trip they took to East Africa or whatever. So really good stuff. I can't thank you enough. I think too often research and academics seems to be out there, and the practitioner is here doing something practical like memorizing a lot of dates and a lot of animal names and stuff. And it needs to all be together. We need to understand why we do what we do. Thank you for joining us today. I couldn't be more delighted with getting personally acquainted with folks that developed that study. So I look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
It's coming out soon. We're wrapping up. We've finished data collection on sort of phase 2 of that big study, so it should be coming out soon. I think we went to 62 different national park units, surveyed 6,000 visitors thereabouts.
At over 400 programs, yeah.
Over 400 programs. So we're replicating that study because a lot of things have changed. Interpreters are innovating all the time, and so we're real excited to see if anything's changed.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, a fascinating afternoon. Thank you so much for your time, expertise, and interest. And we look forward to spending time with you again.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
And I want to thank our audience for tuning in. We're glad to have you here today. We hope you have a wonderful week. I want to thank Marc Stoffel for the beautiful mandolin music I use as an intro and an outro on this podcast. And more about Heartfelt Associates Training, go to interpretivetraining.com. December 1st to the 3rd, Heritage Interpretive Guide, Train the Trainers course using the HEART approach. I'll be teaching that. I have an AI and interpretation seminar coming up, date to be announced soon. Lisa Brochu will be teaching interpretive planning December 8 to 11. And she will also teach contract management December 12. Join us, won't you? Hope you have a wonderful week.